The story of Star Trek is often told as a triumph, a legend beamed down from the future, fully formed and ready to change the world. But the reality, the one buried in forgotten memos and whispered in the corridors of 1960s Hollywood, is far more fragile. It is a story of a show that was dead on arrival, a relic of a television executive's rejection slip, and the quiet, desperate fight to bring it back to life. This is the story of how the impossible happened, and why the official history, for decades, was a carefully constructed myth. In the executive offices of the National Broadcasting Company, the verdict was swift and final. It was 1965, and Gene Roddenberry, a former airline pilot with a head full of stars and a typewriter full of ideals, had just presented his vision for a serious science fiction series. The pilot was called The Cage. It was thoughtful, philosophical, and featured a diverse crew under the command of Captain Christopher Pike. The network's reaction was a polite but crushing blow: it was too cerebral. In the language of the boardroom, this was code for a complete and utter failure. A fully financed pilot was a massive investment, and to reject it was to essentially kill the project. Most shows, at this point, are simply buried and forgotten. But something strange happened. NBC, despite their scathing review, didn't walk away. They saw a glimmer of potential, a unique quality they couldn't quite define. They offered Roddenberry a second chance, a near unprecedented move that spoke to the quiet power of his central idea. There were, however, conditions. Captain Pike was out. In his place would be a new, more dynamic captain, a figure who would eventually be named James T. Kirk. But the most significant, and most telling, compromise came in the form of a single character. Roddenberry had written a female first officer, a woman of color in a position of supreme authority. NBC executives, bound by the unshakable sexism of the era, told him this was unbelievable to audiences. The science was fine, the aliens were fine, but a woman in command was a step too far. It was a moment of profound frustration for Roddenberry. He was forced to remove the character from the command chair, but he didn't remove the actress, a brilliant performer named Nichelle Nichols. She was quietly recast as Nurse Chapel, a role the network found far more palatable. Roddenberry, however, was playing a longer game. He held onto his vision, waiting for the moment he could bring it back to life. The casting of the show was a chaotic, uncertain process that would shape its destiny in ways no one could predict. The role of Captain Kirk, destined to become a global icon, was not William Shatner's from the start. Several other actors were seriously considered, their names now lost to a history they almost wrote themselves. The uncertainty was palpable, nothing about this cast felt inevitable. Then there was Leonard Nimoy, the man who would become Spock. His casting was a triumph, but his continued presence on the show was anything but guaranteed. An early, deeply personal creative disagreement threatened to end his involvement before it even began. He fought to define the character as more than a simple alien, as a symbol of logic and emotional repression that would resonate with millions. His eventual triumph, secured through quiet tension, became the foundation of his legendary performance. But the most profound story of the show's early days lies with Nichelle Nichols. By the end of the first season, she was done. The role felt limited, and her potential felt wasted. She had written her resignation letter, ready to move on to other opportunities. What happened next is one of the quietest, most powerful stories in Hollywood history. At a civil rights event, she was approached by a man who told her she could not leave. He spoke with an authority that was both humble and absolute, telling her that her presence on that show, in that uniform, in that role, was doing something that no speech or protest could do. That she was a symbol of a future that was worth fighting for. The children watching needed to see her. That man was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Nichols, her resolve shattered and reforged, stayed. The show was never the same without her, and its legacy is forever intertwined with her decision. The writers, once the show was in production, understood they were working inside a system with invisible walls. In the 1960s, certain topics, race, war, social injustice, were off limits. To break these rules was to invite censorship or cancellation. So, the writers devised an elegant workaround. If you wanted to write about racism, you set the story on an alien planet. If you wanted to explore the horror of war, you disguised it as a conflict between alien civilizations. The network censors were checking for certain words and images, but they weren't always checking for meaning. The writers became masters of smuggling truth past the gatekeepers, burying their most powerful arguments in plain sight. One episode, an allegory for racial hatred, reportedly came so close to the real thing that NBC executives wanted it pulled the night before broadcast. It aired anyway. By 1968, the network had seen enough. The ratings for Star Trek's second season were not where they needed to be. The show was expensive, and the return wasn't justifying the cost. The decision was made: Star Trek was cancelled. As far as NBC was concerned, the story was over. But then, something unprecedented happened. The fans, a passionate and articulate group of viewers, organized. They launched a letter-writing campaign of staggering scale, sending over 100,000 letters to NBC. These were not emotional pleas, they were detailed, specific arguments about the show's cultural and intellectual value. Engineers, scientists, and academics all wrote in. NBC, stunned by the outpouring, reversed course and renewed the show for a third season. But the renewal came with a condition: Star Trek was moved to a Friday night time slot, a graveyard for television shows. The budget was slashed, and key creative personnel left. The show that fans had fought so hard to save felt alien and unfamiliar. It was a classic Pyrrhic victory. The show was cancelled again after season 3, but this time, the seed of something far more powerful had been planted. On screen, the bridge of the Enterprise was a vision of utopia, a crew united by purpose. Off-screen, the reality was far more complex. The production was fractured by personal conflicts and professional jealousies, hidden by a public relations machine that was desperate to maintain the image of a happy family. Roddenberry himself was under immense pressure, his authority being quietly eroded as his personal and professional life crumbled around him. The writer's room was a battlefield of ego and credit disputes. This is the part of the story that is rarely told. The show that gave us hope was born from a crucible of conflict and human imperfection. It's the kind of truth that, once known, changes the way you see something you loved. The mythology was beautiful, but the reality was messy, human, and complex. When Star Trek ended its original run in June 1969, the general consensus was that it had been a failure. It ran for 3 seasons, never achieved strong ratings, and was cancelled twice. By every standard metric, it was over. Then came the unforeseen miracle: syndication. Television stations, desperate to fill airtime, began broadcasting Star Trek reruns in local time slots. And people watched, not just casually, but obsessively. College students organized viewing parties. A new generation discovered the show, finding in its alien encounters and philosophical dilemmas a relevance that had been overlooked in its first run. A show that had been dismissed by its own network found, in reruns, an audience more passionate than anything it had reached during its original broadcast. Merchandise, models, and books began to sell. Fan conventions drew tens of thousands. A commercial ecosystem grew around a show that was technically dead. Then came the moment that made even the most hardened skeptics reconsider. In 1976, NASA unveiled the first prototype space shuttle. Its name, chosen in direct response to a letter-writing campaign from the very fans who had saved the show, was Enterprise. Gene Roddenberry stood there, watching a real spacecraft carry the name of his fictional starship. By his own account, he was rendered speechless. The show that had been called too cerebral, cancelled twice, and dismissed as a failure had reached a place no television program had ever reached before. But there is one more layer to this story, a final detail that reframes everything. Go back to the very beginning. Not to 1966, when the show premiered, but to those first few days when Roddenberry was still developing the concept. Before a single actor was cast or a script written, he made a decision. He decided that Star Trek would not reflect the world as it was, but as it could be. It would be a sustained, serious argument that humanity was capable of something better. This was his guiding philosophy. Every time the network pushed back, every time they demanded a more conventional show, Roddenberry held this line. The diverse cast was not an accident, it was the argument made visible. When NBC told him a woman couldn't be a first officer, he understood they were attacking his argument. He made the compromise, but he held the line on the philosophy. He found a way to resist the pressure to make Star Trek more comfortable. Most fans have heard fragments of this story, but few have seen it laid out completely. When you hold the full picture, the rejection, the compromises, the casting fights, the cancelled seasons, the syndication miracle, the shuttle named Enterprise, it stops looking like a story about luck. It starts looking like something that was always going to happen because one person, Gene Roddenberry, decided that he would not let it be anything less than what he believed it could be. That decision is the quiet center of everything Star Trek became. The show was dead, but it refused to stay that way.